It was the smell that gave her away. A soft whiff of cologne hit me as Emma slid into bed beside me, one I'd never smelled on her before. For a second, I thought I must be imagining it, but as she settled down, pulling the covers up to her neck, the scent lingered. That was when it hit me. She wasn't wearing my cologne. "Where were you tonight?" I asked, my voice coming out calmer than I felt. She turned to look at me, her eyes wide, but she tried to smile, even if it trembled at the corners. "Just a work dinner. I told you about it yesterday." The room was silent except for our breathing, but my chest felt heavy, weighed down by suspicion that had been creeping up for months. Late nights, frequent dinners with clients, a distance between us I couldn't close no matter how hard I tried. "I'm sure it went well," I said slowly. "But I was thinking, it's strange, don't you think? Coming home with someone else's cologne on?" The color drained from her face, and she sat up, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for something to say. My heart was pounding, but I kept my face calm. I wanted to see her try to lie. Well, it must have been someone at the dinner. You know, those tiny spaces. Sometimes it just sticks to your clothes." I nodded, looking her in the eyes. "You're pregnant, aren't you?" The words hung in the air like a blade, waiting to drop. Her face twisted, something I couldn't recognize. Fear, maybe. And she looked away. "What? Why would you—" "You have a doctor's appointment tomorrow," I interrupted, my tone flat. "The calendar app. It's not even private, Emma." Her face collapsed, and she dropped her head into her hands. I was going to tell you, I swear. I just needed to find the right moment." "The right moment," she said. Not one word about the other question. Silence filled the room as I waited for her to explain herself, to tell me this was all some misunderstanding. But instead, I heard her take a sharp breath, then finally, a soft whisper, almost inaudible. I'm so sorry." She didn't have to say anything else. Her apology was the confession. I felt something inside me break, splintering into pieces, but all I could manage was a dull, hollow feeling that numbed everything else. "Who?" I asked. One word, but it felt like 1,000 questions. How long had this been going on, and why hadn't I seen it coming? "His name's Derek. He works in the same department." It wasn't supposed to go this far." "Then why did it?" The anger in my voice was startling, even to me. She looked at me, her eyes shining with tears she didn't deserve to shed. "I never meant to hurt you. It was just something that happened, and I was lonely, I guess." My jaw tightened, and I forced myself to look away. "Lonely? When we're married, and I've been here every day thinking you loved me." She shook her head, and I realized she didn't have an answer to that. She tried to reach out, her hand hovering over mine, but I pulled back before she could touch me. The distance between us felt like a chasm now, and I wasn't sure if we could ever bridge it again. I'll stay at my sister's tonight," she whispered. And without another word, she slipped out of bed, grabbed her purse, and left. As the door clicked shut, the enormity of what she had done finally sank in, and I was left in the silence of our once shared bedroom, wondering how things had gone so horribly wrong. Emma didn't come home the next day, or the day after that. Each night I expected her to come back, to beg for forgiveness, to try to explain herself in some way that made sense. But my phone stayed silent, and she didn't even bother to check in. It was like I'd ceased to exist in her world. The anger simmered, mixing with a dull ache that gnawed at me every time I thought about her betrayal. I did everything I could to keep myself busy, throwing myself into work. But it didn't matter. Every night I came home to an empty house, and every night I felt a little more hollow. One evening, a full week after she left, I heard the door creak open. I looked up, pulse quickening, only to see her standing in the doorway, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "Hey," she said softly. I didn't respond, just leaned back against the counter, waiting for her to say what she'd come to say. After a long pause, she sighed. I thought about things, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'm here to try to make this right. Make it right? I said, my voice hard. How are you going to make this right, Emma? You cheated on me, and now there's a child involved. She flinched, guilt flashing across her face. I know. I never should have let it go this far. It was a stupid mistake, and I regret it more than anything. I clenched my fists, feeling the betrayal swell up inside me again. Do you even love me? I demanded. Or was that a lie too? Her face crumpled and she looked away, but she didn't answer. The silence was worse than any answer she could have given. Just tell me what you want, Emma. Do you want to stay, or do you want to be with him? Her gaze fell to the floor, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. The numbness turned to rage, and I felt myself shaking. You don't know? I repeated, incredulous. After all this, you still don't know? Tears streamed down her face as she hugged herself, looking small and defeated. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, she admitted. I didn't think things would go this far. I was just looking for something, and I didn't think about what it would do to us. Her words stung, and I realized I couldn't bear to hear them anymore. I think you need to go, Emma. Figure out what you really want. She nodded, her face crumpling as she gathered her things. But just as she reached the door, she stopped, turning back to look at me with one last, desperate look. Please don't hate me. I couldn't respond. And a second later, she was gone, leaving me alone with nothing but broken trust and an empty house that had once been our home. Days turned into weeks. After Emma's last visit, I didn't hear a word from her. No calls, no texts, nothing. At first, it felt like a relief, a temporary balm that allowed me to shut down and avoid thinking about what she'd done. But as time passed, the silence became unbearable. Questions nagged at me day and night. Was she with him now? Did she still plan to have the baby? And where did all of this leave me? One afternoon, I found myself scrolling through her social media, something I never used to do, looking for any hint, any clue about where she might be or what she was doing. I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Pictures of sunsets, coffees, a new book she'd posted about reading. The same shallow posts, almost as if nothing in her life had changed at all. And maybe for her, it hadn't. Maybe I was the only one who felt like the world had cracked open beneath my feet. A few days later, I got a call from my sister, Lisa. Have you heard from Emma? She asked, her voice hesitant. No, she's staying with her sister, I think. Lisa was quiet for a moment. I don't mean to intrude, but are you okay, really? You don't sound okay. I could feel my composure slipping. She's pregnant, Lisa, with another man's child. The words came out flat, devoid of the fire that had once been there. I'd repeated the line so many times in my head it barely stung anymore. It was just a fact, a piece of information that existed now as part of my life. I'm sorry, Ben. You didn't deserve this, she said gently. Maybe it's time to think about what you want to do now, not what she wants, what you want. The idea felt foreign. For so long, every decision I'd made had been based on us, on our marriage, our future together. Now I had to figure out what my own future looked like, alone. And with that realization, a strange sense of freedom started to creep in. I'd wasted enough energy trying to understand Emma's choices. Maybe it was time to think about my own. Meanwhile, Emma's world wasn't quite as tranquil as her social media suggested. She'd moved in with her sister Anna, thinking she'd only stay a few days. But days turned into weeks, and she still hadn't found the courage to face me, or herself. Every time she thought about going back, guilt settled in, heavy and unrelenting. One evening, as she sat curled up on Anna's couch, staring at the blank television screen, Her sister joined her. "You can't keep avoiding him forever, Em," Anna said softly. "I know you're hurting, but you've got to face what happened eventually." Emma swallowed, feeling the knot in her throat tighten. "I don't know what to say to him. I made a mess of everything. I should never have let things go this far." Anna's expression was sympathetic but firm. "So why did you?" Emma looked away, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the pillow. "I don't know," she whispered. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't the whole truth. She'd been restless for months, feeling unfulfilled, though she couldn't quite pinpoint why. She'd convinced herself that Ben was to blame, that their marriage had grown stale, and that she deserved something more. She didn't realize, until it was too late, that her dissatisfaction had come from within. And in trying to escape it, she'd destroyed the one solid thing in her life. "Do you love Derek?" Anna asked, cutting through Emma's thoughts. Emma froze. Love. Did she even know what that meant anymore? She'd thought Derek was the answer to her emptiness. He'd given her attention, listened to her frustrations, made her feel young and alive. But now, in the harsh light of her mistakes, she could see how shallow it all had been. "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't even know why I thought he could give me something Ben couldn't." Anna sighed, shaking her head. "Then maybe it's time to start thinking about what you're going to do. You're carrying another man's child, Em. That's not something you can pretend isn't happening." The words hit Emma like a punch to the gut. She'd tried to avoid thinking about it, tried to tell herself she'd figure it out when the time came. But as each day passed, that became harder and harder to believe. The reality of her situation was sinking in, and with it, a wave of regret that felt almost impossible to bear. Later that night, Emma lay awake, replaying memories of her life with Ben, remembering their early days together, the way he'd looked at her like she was the only person in the world, the long walks they'd take together, the plans they'd made, all the little moments she'd taken for granted. She missed him, she realized, more than she'd ever missed anyone. And now, she'd lost him, all because of a mistake she could never take back. The next morning, she picked up her phone, her hands trembling as she typed out a message. "Can we meet? I need to talk to you." She stared at the message, hesitating, her thumb hovering over the send button. She knew that seeing him, facing the pain she'd caused, would be one of the hardest things she'd ever done. But if she didn't, she knew she'd never be able to live with herself. Taking a deep breath, she hit send and waited for his reply.